Hello and welcome back to World 360. How has US military aid to Ukraine reached almost half the amount it was spending every year during the Vietnam War? Why are there calls for the French president to resign? And lastly, what does Chinese President Xi Jinping seek to achieve by visiting Russia this week? We'll cover all this and more in today's episode. First up, Xi Jinping's visit to Russia. In India, all eyes were on Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida's visit to India earlier this week, especially as India and Japan, two Quad partners, seek to work closer in cooperation. But further west, another alliance was on display with Chinese President Xi Jinping's visit to Russia amid the Ukraine war. As we know, China has staunchly supported Russia through this conflict, with recent reports emerging that it is even considering military support to Moscow. But let's also not forget that China has been trying to gain as much support for its 12-point peace plan that was released earlier this year, in which it calls for a ceasefire and cessation of war in Ukraine, while also urging countries to abandon what it termed the Cold War mentality. This visit by Xi Jinping is critical in a relationship between two global powers that have been isolated on the world stage. The Ukraine war has also brought the two countries closer. If you recall, during Russian President Vladimir Putin's visit to Beijing in December 2022, the two leaders committed themselves to a no-limits partnership. The warmth between the two leaders appears to be going very strong. After landing in Moscow, Xi Jinping said earlier this week, "Mr. President, I always call you my dear friend." Putin had also, in his remarks, acknowledged China's proposed peace plans to resolve the Ukraine conflict. He said, "We have carefully studied your proposals on resolving the acute Ukraine crisis, and we will have an opportunity to discuss this matter." Now, according to Russian and Chinese state media, this visit is supposed to be one of solidifying the friendship between Russia and China. But if we look at the larger picture, the visit comes at a very critical time. For one, Putin will head to elections next year. Interestingly, Xi Jinping rallied for Putin in this regard. He said that he was confident that the people of Russia would support Putin if he ran for president in 2024. Now, this seemed to cause quite a stir, prompting Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov to clarify that Xi Jinping did not mean to announce that Putin would be running for another term. The bottom line is that Beijing remains steadfast in deepening cooperation with Russia strategically, whether it's aligning with each other on multilateral platforms like the UN, or deepening synergy on the Belt and Road Initiative, or BRI, or the Eurasian Economic Union. For our second topic, we're looking at how in just 1 year and without any troops on ground, the US's military expenditure on Ukraine has reached half of what it was spending per year during the Vietnam War from 1965 to 1975. This data analysis has come from a Germany-based research institute called Kiel Institute for World Economy, or the IFW. Adjusting for inflation, it shows that US military aid to Ukraine has reached about $47 billion. Now, this is half of the annual military spending by the US during the Vietnam War, which was about $90 billion per year. Even when looking at US military spending in both conflicts as a percentage of GDP, the military expenditure on Ukraine has already reached a quarter of the US's expenditure in Vietnam. The study found that US military spending in Ukraine is about 0.21% of its GDP compared to the annual average in Vietnam, which was about 0.96% of GDP at the time. Now, why are these numbers important? The study's findings come as intense fighting continues between Ukraine and Russia. While Ukraine's soldiers are firing up to 10,000 artillery shells a day, the US and its allies have started sending military tanks to the capital of Kyiv. But there's also the larger question: how could the US be spending this much on the military in Ukraine in a short period of just 1 year, and that too with no troops on ground? Well, the state of global ammunition markets may be able to give us an idea. Since the Russia-Ukraine war started, countries have been ramping up military spending. China wants to increase defense spending by 7.2%, while the UK has just announced it will be increasing military funding by $6 billion over the next 2 years. So there's no doubt a new wave of accelerated defense spending is what we're seeing in the world today. Even a recent CNN report points out how a key ammunition plant in the US state of Pennsylvania is undergoing a major expansion funded by the Pentagon to keep up with the demand for arsenal amid the Ukraine war and also to rebuild the US's own military stockpile. It's come to the point where certain forums and groupings are encouraging countries to ramp up defense spending. For example, NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg recently urged member states to commit at least 2% of their GDP on defense by a set date. And as expected, this is music to the ears of defense businesses. Reports show that the 10 largest weapons manufacturers in the US and Europe increased their sales by 7.5% in the last quarter of 2022. For our last topic, we're looking at France, where President Emmanuel Macron is in the eye of the storm. His controversial retirement plans have got left-wingers and right-wingers out in the streets in protest, and now there are calls for his resignation. Powerful pictures such as this started to emerge, where the entire opposition rallied together to oppose Macron's pension policy. His government may have fended off 2 no-confidence votes in parliament in response to the recent protests, but that's not going to give the French president much relief. A survey on Sunday showed that Macron's personal rating was at its lowest level since the Yellow Vest protest movement in 2019. Now, the Yellow Vest protest movement was a series of grassroots weekly protests in France which called for economic justice and later political reforms as well. It was set off by Macron's decision to introduce a green tax on fuel in France. However, what first began as a protest against the policy quickly turned into a larger movement that included working and middle-class citizens who were ultimately frustrated with the declining standards of living in France. In a way, Macron was seen as a president of the rich. Let's not forget that he's a former investment banker and was also the country's former finance minister. Now, the recent protests against his pension plans also seem to indicate that he's a man who announces decisions with scant discussion or deliberation. And therefore, it is Macron's image and his reputation that has taken a severe hit with this recent policy and has also brought his mandate into question. Thank you so much for watching. This is Pia Krishnankutty for ThePrint.